This is BoomerLife on AlzheimerB.C.
Dr. Julie Robillard is an assistant professor of neurology at UBC and faculty at the National Core for Neuroethics and at the Center for Brain Health. After completing a PhD in neuroscience looking at synaptic plasticity in the aging brain, Dr. Robillard built on her thesis work in a way that emphasizes the human translational side of neuroscience. She leads a research program at the intersection of aging, ethics, and new media, and has developed innovative techniques for the analysis of brain health and social media. Dr. Julie Robillard, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
We're very welcome. Can you give us a very simple explanation of what you do?
Sure. So my research program at UBC and at the National Core for Neuroethics is aimed at evaluating the quality and also the ethics of online resources for dementia. So we're looking at anything from websites that contain information about the prevention of dementia to how dementia is portrayed on social media to tools for example, the diagnosis of dementia that people can access freely online.
It's quite fascinating. How did you end up in this position?
Well, that's a good question. So as you mentioned, I did my PhD in the neuroscience of aging and looking at aging in a very molecular way. I was looking at sort of cellular pathways for memory. And during that time, it occurred to me that very few people were going to become aware of this research that I was doing. A few scientists maybe would read my publications or my thesis, but the general public would not find out about this work or would likely not find out about this work. And so I became interested in what neuroscience makes it into the public eye and how do people use that information to make decisions about their health. And so I became really interested in the field of neuroscience communication, and that's how I became an expert in online health for dementia.
Unbelievable. Why are you so passionate about this topic?
Well, I think the way that people seek and share information is changing very rapidly. And older adults have been typically neglected from research in this area because it's assumed they're not online and they're not spending time on Twitter or on Facebook. But increasingly what's happening is we're realizing that they are. And they're getting a huge amount of information online. And a lot of people are using that information to make decisions about their health. Some of these decisions will be good and some of these decisions won't be so good. It's also going to impact how they interact with their physician, for example. So I think it's just an area of research that's been neglected and that it's great time that we pay attention to it.
Absolutely. I don't think you're alone in those thoughts either. So let's get down to the area of expertise that you have. Is it possible to find good information about Alzheimer's disease and other dementias online?
Well, there's good information and there's bad information out there.
Sure, and how do we filter through it all?
Exactly, and that can be very much a challenge even for people who do not have any kind of cognitive impairment. So for dementia, really there's an additional level of complexity. My research has shown that some online assessments for dementia have ethical issues that are associated with them, and so that can be potentially harmful for people to go online and to interact with these assessments. That said, I'm not suggesting that everything online is not useful or is of bad quality. There's some very good websites out there, the Alzheimer's Society for Canada and also the Alzheimer's Society of BC website, which, if I understand correctly, has just recently been relaunched with new content and a more easy-to-navigate platform. Those are really good sites to start from, and they tend to link to other sites that are of high quality.
So now I'm going to base my next question on the fact that there's a large percentage of us that actually turn to Dr. Google for information. You know, every medical condition that we come up with, we go straight to the internet. And you, having studied brain health analysis, what do you think about the websites that claim to actually launch tests for dementia?
Well, that's a very good question. So one of my research projects was aimed at evaluating these exact tests that you're talking about. So if I go online and I Google free memory test or free Alzheimer test, I'm going to find a lot of these tests that are freely available that I can complete at home. And so we took a sample of 16 of these tests and we ran them by groups of experts. We ran them by geriatricians, so physicians who work with older adults. We ran them by ethicists, by specialists in human-computer interactions, so people who study how we interact with computers, and also by neuropsychologists, who are the clinicians that typically administer these kinds of tests in the clinic. And we asked them what they thought of these 16 tests that we found online. And we found very interesting pieces of information about these tests in two main areas. The first one is scientific validity. So we asked our experts, are these tests valid? Are they based on what we know today about the science of dementia and diagnosing dementia? And what we found is that they were not, in fact, very scientifically valid. And what that tells us is that they're really just not useful to give any sort of meaningful information about whether you have dementia or whether you're even at risk for dementia. We also, in a second arm of the study, evaluated the ethics of these tests. And what we mean by ethics is we're paying attention to things like, is there a conflict of interest? Is the website really just trying to sell you something? Is there a discussion of what the website does with the private information that you might enter while you're completing the test? And what we found for those kinds of criteria is that the tests really were rating very poorly or poorly across the board on all ethics items. And so what that tells us is that actually taking the test can be potentially harmful for people who are browsing and using these tests online.
Interesting. Are any of these statistics published, or are there any other journals that provide some background information? Because I'm just thinking of the layman that goes online and does one of these memory tests, and they're not really sure what they're getting into.
Yeah, that's a huge problem. They're not sure what they're getting into. What we're finding is that the quality of these tests is ranges greatly from very, very poor to somewhat poor. I'll be honest, there are very few good tests out there. It can be very confusing and very challenging to identify which one is the better test, right? Websites are completely unregulated. I can go online and I can set up a test and pretend I'm from the Harvard Medical School, and
absolutely
nobody would know until the Harvard Medical School finds it. And they have, of course, mechanisms to do that. But essentially, it's very difficult to identify information of high quality. So at this time, until these ethical issues are resolved, we're really advising people against trying to diagnose themselves online.
Wow. It's a lot of information to digest. So as someone who's interested in finding out, is there such a test to determine whether I have a dementia problem or an Alzheimer's problem, what would you suggest to them? Or even Maria, on behalf of the Alzheimer's Society, what would you suggest to them? Like, what's the first plan of recourse?
Well, we encourage people to think of tests and information as all little pieces of one big package. I mean, it's important for people to have a variety of information to make decisions, and also help them formulate the questions that they should be taking to their physicians to start that dialogue.
Start with the doctor.
Absolutely. I mean, it's important to get information, and so websites like the Alzheimer's Society of BC, Alzheimer's Society of Canada, and a number of other websites can help people start to sort of maneuver or navigate through all the different issues. But it also then helps them understand when they go to their physician how they can actually start to present their challenges and begin to ask the questions. But certainly people should be very cognizant that the human health condition, and there's so many other factors that could be the core of cognitive limitations, that a simple test can never replace a really comprehensive assessment by a physician and by other allied health professionals.
So I go back a few years. Do you remember the comedian George Carlin? Remember George Carlin?
Absolutely.
Yes, okay. Dr. Robillard, maybe he wasn't around in your day. She's a little bit younger than Maria and myself. George Carlin used to include a little shtick in his comedic skit. Like, he would stand in front of audiences and he spoke very openly about Alzheimer's disease, and he found a way to draft an analogy that said Alzheimer's disease wasn't about losing your car keys, because we all lose our car keys every day. It's like, where do I put my purse? Where do I put my keys? He said it was more comprehensive about if you wake up one day and you forget what those keys are for, that's a little closer to the truth. Does that make any sense?
Absolutely. I mean, we all have changes in our functions as we grow older. That's the natural part of aging, and most people are going to see changes and differences, and that's, again, just part of the body aging. But the changes that one would experience through Alzheimer's or another related dementia is going to be different, and it's also going to be unique to that person. And again, that assessment, that conversation has to be done not just in isolation on a website. It has to be done with people who are experienced and can actually walk through the conversation together.
Absolutely. So Dr. Robillard, what are some of the major misconceptions about Alzheimer's disease or other dementias that you might see online these days?
Well, there's a lot of misconceptions online, but if I were to pick sort of one or two that seem to be more discussed, I think one misconception, and we've already alluded to this, is that dementia is easy to diagnose. That you can do a 2-minute test. Some of these tests really only took 2 minutes of your time, and that's going to give you useful information about whether you have Alzheimer's disease. I think that's a very important misconception. And as Maria alluded to, actually diagnosing Alzheimer's disease is not a quick and dirty task. It's a long process. It involves various different types of clinicians, various different types of tests. So that would be, I think, a misconception that still prevails, and that I would really want to what's the word I'm looking for? That's a misconception that's quite popular online. As well, another misconception is that there can be some things that you can do or some pills that you can take that will guarantee that you will not get Alzheimer's disease. So we see that a lot. Various websites are trying to sell you something that they claim will shield you against later developing the disease. And the current state of the science says that that is not the case. If there was a miracle pill that you could take, you would know.
If there was a quick fix, we'd all be taking it.
Exactly. So there is really not any one thing. And even if we think about behaviors that are commonly thought to be useful for the prevention of Alzheimer's disease, things like exercising and diet, those are useful. Those are some of the best things you can do. But as of now, nothing will shield you 100% from developing the disease. And I think that's important for people to understand and to make sure that they adhere to those healthy behaviors as much as they can, but not necessarily spend any kind of money for a miracle cure or a miracle treatment, for example.
Mm-hmm. So as an expert in the field of the information that's available online, tell me how you spend your day. How do you stay current with all the information?
Well, I am very lucky that I interact very closely with the UBC Hospital Clinic for Dementia and Related Disorders at UBC. And so we have weekly meetings where we talk about the latest in the science and the latest findings and the latest research. It's also for academics important to go to conferences. Every year there's national and international conferences where you can get a really good sense of what's happening in the field at this point in time. And of course, in terms of researching online health, I have to spend time online, and a lot of my students tend to like that. They actually have a legitimate reason to be on Twitter. But I do spend a fair amount of time online looking at what people are posting, what people are thinking, and what sort of information is being shared.
And if we want to follow you on Twitter?
At Scientific Chick.
Scientific Chick. You're listening to Boomer Life on CL 650. I'm Joanne Sutton, joined in studio today with Alzheimer's Society BC CEO Maria Howard and Dr. Julie Robillard. Thank you so much for joining us today. We've covered a lot of ground, and I know there's a lot more to come. So when we return from the break, we're going to answer some questions about how to get some direct help from the Alzheimer's Society BC. And you can always get more information online at AlzheimerB.C.org.
Celebrating the baby boomer lifestyle. This is Boomer Life on CL 650.